Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to my sewing room. It's nice and dry over here. I heard there was a water main break over in the north, so I hope everyone's doing okay and adhering to water restrictions as well. It's an interesting morning here
Yeah.
in Calgary. So hopefully they get that cleared up really soon. I have my buddy Cliff here. He's going to take us through some really cool threading tips that will help us maintain the performance of our machine and keep us sewing fabulously.
And not getting frustrated.
We don't want to get frustrated while we sew. It's, a very calming situation that we need to create. Well,
So
I will send it on over to Cliff.
if you can switch the camera.
I
to
sure
machine,
can.
Chelsea. Hello everyone. One of the main issues that we get phone calls for and queries about in the service bay all the time, and it usually shows up in the form of a spot check service, is threading issues. And I want to go over the concepts of things that I have noticed being a technician for the last 6 years. I get to see how, because we have to sew out on a machine every time we work on it, and that at the beginning of it to find out if we can create the failures you're having and then determine what's wrong with the machine, or if it's something else entirely. A lot of times it is something else, and it's your thread path. The path that the thread takes through the tension units in the machine up to the take-up lever and then back down into your needle. If you have any sort of obstruction of any kind in your thread path, that will absolutely affect how your stitch quality, for one thing. If your thread breaks at the needle, if you get consistent thread breakage at your needle, 9 times out of 10, and that's what I've discovered over these years of doing spot checks and stuff, it's thread path. Or there's just something obstructing the thread from flowing smoothly from the spool into the machine. Now, I get a lot of pushback on this from experienced sewers and stuff, and I've been corrected about it, and unfortunately, I'm right because I've done this enough through solving tension issues to see how the thread is behaving right here, how it's behaving right here. You're sewing, so your eyes are down here. You're watching what your fabric and your thread and your needle are doing. You don't have time to go up here and look at what's going on with your spool. Excuse me, I'm still dealing with that weird throat thing, so you just bear with me. Spools like the Isocord one here are fine on your horizontal spool pin, and that up to a point with a certain size spool cap. So this spool cap is okay, but there have been instances where someone has slid on the larger spool cap and the thread is lower. The volume of thread is now lower on the spool. So what happens is you get it. I'm just going to put the machine back a little bit and just show you this spool here. So as you can see, this spool, very low on thread, and what happens is when the thread is coming off of the spool, and that it has to fight over the end cap of that spool. The thread is going to contact with that every once in a while as it is being pulled by the take-up lever system, the take-up system, into the needle as it's sewing. So you're going to get this tugging sensation that happens. And that tugging sensation, you can literally just take your thread, don't have it threaded in the needle, and see what's happening if you're getting an issue there. So have your spool on the spool pin. Even if you have a smaller spool cap in here, this cap on the spool is going to affect it. I'm serious, it will. I've seen it happen all the time. As soon as I've told the customer to put it vertical, it stops. And the stitch looks great. They're not getting obstruction anymore, and the problem goes away. But continuing to fight over this edge can be a real nightmare. And the way you can test if it's grabbing is you pull your thread out of your needle, leaving it completely threaded still, but just pull it out of the needle, and then pull yourself a length of thread about 6 inches long. Take your thumb, slide it up to where the needle is, and then pull the thread with the presser foot down. See what the tension feels like. Put the presser foot back up. You'll feel that there's no tension on your thread, but you will start to see this. This is what it'll look like. You'll start to see the spool doing this. And the reason why it's doing that is because the thread is getting caught at the high. So once the thread moves from here up to the closer end of this cap, it's going to fight when it's underneath here, and it's going to make it pop up. When that thread tugs, it's tugging through your tension system all the way down to your needle. And then your needle will start getting tugging, and it will flex back and forth like this.
Oh, so you could break a needle.
You could break a needle because it's flexing the needle. The needle could hit your presser foot. It could hit your stitch plate. It could hit your hook.
Or your bobbin case.
Or your bobbin case. And you're going to hear a bang. Or your thread just simply snaps. A lot of times on Brothers, the thread will simply snap at the needle. The thread shoots up inside. And this is what I talked about in the last tech tip was thread getting wrapped around the take-up lever. And that's because thread breaks at the needle. It springs back because thread has spring in it. Springs back up inside of here. Machine is still running because sometimes you don't see it happen. And then it gets caught around the take-up lever, and then you get issues. So you always want to keep your thread path unobstructed. So again, if you're using spools of thread like this, once the volume of thread gets really low and you see that this cap may be interfering, Brothers sometimes come with an accessory, which is a little vertical spool pin that you can put right on the bobbin winder right here. It just clicks right on, and then put your your spool just on it like that. And then your thread has a free path to flow into the tension system, and that it's not being obstructed anymore. If it doesn't have that, I do highly recommend everybody invest in one of these, a thread stand and stuff. This is what we use in the service bay all the time. Is we have a large spool of thread on the thread stand. Our path is constantly clear of any obstructions, and we can sew without any hindrances. When you use a thread stand, and though, you may want to also use a thread net. These come in this length, and you can cut them to the length for the size of the spool that you're using. So like the Isacord one, you'd probably cut it about like that. So there's a little bit up top and a little bit that folds underneath the bottom of the cap. This helps control the wind. So I'm going to show you this bit of thread here that's all wound up on itself. So as you see how the thread is all wound up on itself there, and it springs back. And the reason why it does that is thread retains the memory of being wound on the spool. And the lower the spool gets, the more tight that wind is, the more memory there's going to be in this. So when the thread is coming up off the spool stand and stuff with the thread net on here, that thread net helps the thread relax. It needs a distance to relax before it gets into the take-up system or into the tension system. If the thread goes through the tension system with a loop like this, you'll hear it, like you'll hear a chunk sound as it's going through the tension unit. It'll do this on Berninas too. You'll hear a sound, and then 9 times out of 10, it'll snap at your needle, or it'll snap your needle, or your needle will have a needle strike, because this has created an obstruction. Now, like I said, because you're not really watching the behavior of your thread, because you're watching what you're sewing, it is good practice to every so often look up and watch what your spool in your machine is doing. Watch how it's behaving. If it is bouncing, like I showed you there with this one, if you see it doing this, you know that the thread is being tugged. And that is a tension problem. This is creating more tension than the tension that's already set on your machine. It's adding more. So your stitch quality is going to look terrible. It'll probably start pulling your bobbin thread through the top. And that because this is increasing the tension and it's increasing chances of breaking. So if you see it doing this on a brother, if you have that vertical pin, put it on there, put your spool on there, and then you have a clear path. Berninas, the bigger ones, they have, actually let's just get a Bernina. Let's just pull a Bernina off here.
You can stick that one over here if you like, Cliff.
Oh, before I do that, as I was talking about spool caps, the accessories that come with it, so this is a spool of Isacord, this cap is fine. There's also a smaller gray cap that actually fits in the hole of the Isacord spools, and then it's completely out of the way. The large spool cap is going to create issues just like this does. Because it's too big, the thread has to arc over top of it, it will touch it, and it creates an obstruction. Okay, so with the Bernina, a lot of them, so this is a 5 series, so it's a little bit different than the 7s and the 8s.
But it sure is cute.
So here's your horizontal spool pin back here, and that with a cap on it, which is fine for the Isacord cap. And the same thing will happen if you're using a cap that's too big. Even on a Bernina, it's going to do that. There's an obstruction. The thread has to go over top of that cap, come down into the tension unit, and it's going to, every once in a while, when the thread reaches this end, it's going to struggle to get over that. And it's going to create all sorts of problems. So if you're using a spool like this guy on here, and it's low like this, there's your vertical. Pop it on there, use that one instead. On the 7s, they're back here and they hinge up. Same with the 8s, they hinge up. The 4s, maybe even the 3s, the 3, 4s, and 5s have this guy that just ejects like that.
Really slick.
That's the reason why it's there, is so that you can switch from your horizontal spool pin position to the vertical when your spool is getting low and this is not obstructing your flow of thread. That's about it.
Well, I can honestly say I did not know that about when your large spools of thread, they get so low. I had no idea that was causing things to bounce like that.
I'll show you something else too that's kind of fascinating that I discovered just because I fix machines and because we get these people saying, "Oh, my tension sucks. It just doesn't look right. It never looks right." And automatically, it's human behavior. You want to blame the machine.
I do sometimes, yes.
Not an inanimate object like a spool of thread.
Oh, I turned off your close that. One moment.
Yeah.
There you go.
Not an inanimate object like a spool of thread. And that. So there's a lot of contingencies. I've said this to a lot of our customers. Thread, needle, fabric relationship is an entire science. I swear somebody has written a college dissertation on thread-needle relationship alone, and you can probably find it online. It's like 90,000 pages
I'm
long.
sure it exists.
So gaining knowledge in thread behavior and needle size is one thing, but also in the types of spools and types of threads that you're using. So there are cotton threads that you'll notice are, in the service bay, we call them chunky. And they have a texture to them. So when you slide your fingers over them like this, you can feel little textures and stuff. And cotton is an organic material in that, and it's fuzzy and fluffy and stuff like that. And that can hinder its behavior going through certain needles. So you want to make sure you're using the right needle with your thread, because if you require cotton for your project or you swear by cotton alone, then you have to adapt your needle to behave correctly with your thread. Isocord is a synthetic. When you slide your fingers across it, you can feel it's smooth and stuff. It's kind of plasticky. It has a little more stretch to it. And with that in mind, the Isocord doesn't snap as easily as cotton does. Cotton will break easier.
True.
Isocord will have a tendency of tugging that needle. So if you have an obstruction, it'll tug
Snap
your
it.
needle more, and it may break your needle versus the thread actually breaking, whereas the cotton will break first. And that because it's an organic material, it's not as rubbery or stretchy as a synthetic, right?
Yeah.
So you have to keep all that in mind. So when you look at your caps and you see a large spool of thread, so you look at this guy and it's full, you're not thinking about these end caps could be a problem. That's the last thing that went into your mind. Why would you think about that?
It's not a thing I ever
No,
thought
of
about
course
myself.
not.
I always knew I had to have a smaller spool cap on,
Yeah.
but I didn't think my actual
Yeah, this
spool
will
of
even do
thread
it.
could
So
be a
what
problem.
happens as the thread, closer, as the thread, because the thread is wound like this, say this is the end going to your machine. When it gets up here, it's really tight up against the cap here. So when the thread gets, well, let's just flip it this way because I'm closer to that end. The thread sometimes can fight against the cap. And then it goes like this. So that's when you're going to see this little bounce in your machine.
Well,
when
you
you see
hear
that little
it.
bounce, just switch it to a vertical and your thread will be fine. It's not bad thread. Doesn't mean that whatsoever. Thread isn't bad at all. It's just the dynamic of the way the spool is designed and how much thread is left on it. You want your spool to react to the power of the machine and that. So if we all know how fast these things are spinning.
They
They're
can go
spinning
so fast.
really fast. When you get a needle strike, it probably scares the hell out of you. You get a bang and then the needle breaks and then you're looking at your stitch plate, you're looking at all sorts of stuff to see what else broke and that. And sometimes it's literally just the spool of thread. It got tugged and it caused the needle to flex slightly and it hit something. That does not mean you've done anything wrong. That does not mean that there's something wrong with the machine.
It doesn't mean there's something wrong with your thread,
That's right.
but it's just the way the thread is going
That's
into
right.
the machine.
So I learned all this by many spot checks of people coming in saying my tension's wacky and stuff. And I would run it through the machine and I'd sew on it and it would be sewing just fine. And then all of a sudden, bang, it would happen. It's like, okay, what caused that? Until I started to look at the spool and what was happening, is it didn't clue into me. And then I saw it. I literally saw the spool bounce. I saw a tugging happening. And it's like, what is causing that? You open up the machine and you look at the tension units. There's nothing in the tension unit. What is doing this? Process of elimination. You work backwards from the incident to possibly what happened. And it's a process. And if everything leading backwards is clear, the only remaining obstacle is your thread. So what is it? It's the caps. The right size caps, a thread net in some instances, a vertical spool stand. You change that up, and if it works, you don't have to make that phone call.
I think you might have just solved my embroidery problem at home that I'm
That'll
having.
do it. It'll do it
I
with
think-
embroidery too.
I
Yeah.
think he might have just solved it. I'm going to go home and use some of these tips,
Yep,
and I'm going to do it, and I'll let you know if it fixed it.
absolutely.
That's really cool.
Don't
I hope
ever-
that's what it is.
Don't ever be afraid to purchase yourself a bigger spool stand, like the ones that we sell. They're
guy's pretty awesome.
They're inexpensive. I believe they're around $25.
Yeah.
And that we keep them in stock in the store here.
And they're heavy.
I highly recommend them. You can get your thread away from all that stuff that's happening up on top of your machine, and it has a nice clear path. Depending on the types of thread you use, like let's talk the mylar infused threads, the glittery stuff.
Oh, the fancy
Okay, the fancy
stuff.
stuff. Invisible thread. Those are all synthetic threads.
They retain their memory so much.
The glittery ones are made of mylar. Mylar is a plastic. Invisible thread, it's fishing line, essentially. It's made of plastic. It's made of a nylon. And if you go up to, if anybody in your family fishes, if you fish, unwind that off the spool, and it just sits there like a coil. It looks like a slinky. And can you imagine that going through your sewing machine?
It would make it dizzy.
Exactly. You would have to make sure that your thread path is clear and that thread is straight, or it's going to do that weird coil thing up, hit your tension unit. You're going to get needle breakage. You're going to wreck your tension unit and stuff. So be very careful using those fancier type materials. And again, match those threads to the correct needle.
Yes.
Because if you're using an incorrect needle, it could cause problems too. Thread and needle relationship is very, very important, and it requires some study. I guess that's it.
That was really cool. I'm going to try all those techniques at home.
Cool.
And I remember one day you did suggest to me, I have a brother NQ575.
Yep.
You recommended removing my lid from my machine.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
So that it doesn't have that extra path to go by when it's on its thread.
It's very handy.
It's already missing it.
It's very handy.
Would you like it on a top camera?
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Very handy because this has all your stitch designs right here to have it sitting in front of you attached to your machine. But these do pop off gently and stuff. And they pop back on.
Oh, here, let's put you on a close up. There we
So
go.
they connect right here, and you'll see inside there's 2 pins on either side. One pin has this little tab thing that's flexible and that, but you can just take these and you gently flex it and it pops out and then just sit this aside. Then again, if you're using a vertical thread stand off the side of your machine, you're going to want this out of the way, because as your thread's coming off the vertical stand, this could be an obstruction too, and you don't want your thread hitting this thing. So these do pop off, and to pop it back on, this little, gotta get in front of the camera, this first little tab goes in the first little hold over here, and then this is the springy one that pops into place. And you just, let's see, we can get this. So if you watch that tab go into that hole, and then you just slide it in, you'll hear it double click sometimes. There it goes. And it's on.
Fabulous.
So sometimes you may want this out of the way. If you want it on there all the time, just make sure that your thread stand is in a position that your thread can come across here without obstructing any of this stuff. It just comes across nice and straight into the tension unit.
Fantastic.
And you're good.
All good information. I like it. I learned so much today, Cliff. I'm going to use those techniques at home.
Cool.
100%.
Cool.
And I'll update you if it worked.
Yeah. Embroidery suffers the same issues
My embroidery is the one that's having troubles.
because it'll tug at the fabric.
Yes.
And you're creating another dynamic that's going on with embroidery. You're going through stabilizer, through fabric, and density of threads that have crossed over. So you're adding density, which is tugging on your thread. So if you have density pushing your thread through and something in the way up here, you have this tug of war that's going on, and the thread will snap.
At some point, my thread springs
Yep.
and gets really long. So I'm going to add one of those thread nets and
Yep.
we'll see how it goes.
Thread nets are great.
I'm hoping it helps.
My spool stand has a thread net on it.
Fabulous. I think most of the boys in service have a
We all
thread
do.
net on them.
Yeah. Yep.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks
I
for
learned
having
so much.
And again, anybody that runs into this sort of weird thing, we're just a phone call away. A lot of times it can be alleviated through a phone call. But if it's really got you confounded, come in, we can solve the problem in a spot check always.
Fabulous.
Yep.
Thank you, Cliff.
You're welcome.
Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Have a great